Welcome to Montgomery College, to the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus, the original campus of Montgomery College, and to our beautiful Cultural Arts Center. If you can't tell, I'm a little excited. I'm having a little bit of an adrenaline rush right now. We have something really wonderful planned for you this evening. My name is Brad Stewart, and I have the honor of being the Vice President and Provost of the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus. And I had a very interesting analytic speech for all of you, but about 3 minutes ago I decided to trash it because I'm so excited. One of my intellectual heroes is here tonight. And let me tell you why I count him among my intellectual heroes. It might not be exactly why you think, so here it goes. Long time ago, well, maybe not that long ago, about 20 years ago, I taught a series of courses called In Race and Ethnicity at a very affluent university in the Midwestern United States, which was, how do I want to put this diplomatically, demographically homogeneous. Does that work? Sometimes I had 2 or 3 sections of the course, and there would be no students from groups other than the affluent white suburbs in which this institution was located. And boy, when you are teaching about concepts like prejudice and discrimination, and particularly things like institutional discrimination, that can really be a tough row to hoe. But I was struggling. To be honest about that. My students had all believed that that the civil rights movement had eradicated prejudice and discrimination and racism in this country. It was all over. By the way, they thought that the women's movement had eradicated all traces of sexism in American society too. It was an interesting group of students. And so I was trying to break through this particular mindset. And as I was struggling until I found a book by Dr. William Julius Wilson, our esteemed speaker tonight, called When Work Disappears. And what this book does is an amazing combination of structural analysis and the words of the residents of inner city Chicago about what happens when the companies that provide all the jobs in the inner city area flee to the suburbs or flee to other countries. And what happens when literally work disappears and what's left behind in that inner city thing. And the words of those people finally got through to my students. They finally understood that discrimination is still alive and well. And I hope they understand 20 years later that there's still something not quite right in America, that the deck is stacked against too many folks in America. And what I love most about working at Montgomery College is that we help to unstack that deck or level the playing field for so many of our students. So I didn't find Professor Wilson down at the Library of Congress by myself. I had an amazing faculty member in the sociology department here at Montgomery College, Bess Vincent. Locate Dr. Wilson and convince him to come. And so she gets the honor of introducing one of my heroes, William Julius Wilson. Bess, will you please come out and do your thing? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bess Vincent, and I have the honor of introducing our distinguished guest this evening. Before doing so, I do have a few practical notes. If you're a student and you need a certificate of attendance for being here, they were available outside and they will be available after the talk if you need to pick one up. If you're faculty and staff and you need the Multicultural and Diversity Training Certificate, those were also available and will be available again outside in the front. We also ask that you silence your cell phones and turn off all screens to avoid distractions for others. There will be some of Professor Wilson's books available for purchase at the concession stand after the talk. They are limited in number, so just letting you know, I would imagine the bookstore would be willing to take orders if they run out, and Professor Wilson has graciously agreed to sign those if you would like one signed. After the presentation, you see that there are 2 microphones located up here in the front, and we will be taking questions. So keep that in mind. We will ask you to come forward to those microphones if you have questions, so be prepared. Now tonight we're very fortunate to have Professor William Julius Wilson here with us. Professor Wilson is one of the most prominent American sociologists alive, writing prolifically on the effects of race and class in inner-city neighborhoods, with emphasis placed on the de-skilling of these communities at the same time that deindustrialization took many jobs away from them. His research is very important in a sociological sense, but it also crosses across fields of criminology, race relations, urban planning, and community development. Perhaps most importantly, though, his body of work speaks a great deal to what we do in community colleges, since the transmission of both hard and soft skills are critical to our mission. Here at Montgomery College, we have an extraordinarily diverse community with 178 countries represented. The personal biographies of these students vary widely, and with the axes of gender, race, class, and location producing vastly different worldviews. These factors make for our particular institution a great audience for Professor Wilson's message, and we thank him immensely for coming. William Julius Wilson received his PhD from Washington State University in 1966. He taught sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst before joining the University of Chicago faculty in 1972. In 1990, he was appointed the Lucy Flower University Professor and Director of the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Urban Inequality. He joined the faculty of Harvard in July of 1996, where he's now a Lewis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor. He's one of only 24 university professors, the highest professional distinction for a Harvard faculty member. Currently, he's a scholar in residence at the Library of Congress, serving as the Kluge Chair in American Law and Governance through May of 2015. While there, he's working to refine theories laid out in his work, The Declining Significance of Race, where he suggested that economic class was more critical than race in determining future life outcomes. Professor Wilson is the author of numerous publications, including The Declining Significance of Race, The Truly Disadvantaged, When Work Disappears, and The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. More recently, he's the co-author of There Goes the Neighborhood, Racial, Ethnic, and Class Tensions in 4 Chicago Neighborhoods and Their Meaning for America, and Good Kids in Bad Neighborhoods, Successful Development in Social Context. Tonight, Professor Wilson will deliver a presentation titled, The Truly Disadvantaged Revisited, Critical Reflections on the Recent Research on Concentrated Urban Poverty. In 1987, when he published his book, The Truly Disadvantaged, it quickly earned its place in the sociological canon. In this work, Professor Wilson discusses how the growth of the urban underclass is tied to the opportunity structure present in American society. Factors such as discrimination, migration, industrial restructuring, and urban planning have worked in culmination to produce inner-city neighborhoods plagued by joblessness, economic segregation, social isolation, and little hope for change. Scholars have viewed Professor Wilson's work as crucial to a discussion of urban poverty, and some, such as our own Art Wallenstein, are you here? Yes. Okay. Have described his work as the finest piece of analytical and policy literatures that I have ever read. But true to any good scholarly research, it sparked debate over the roles of both race and class in producing concentrated poverty. Furthermore, his work contributes to a larger debate surrounding the importance of cultural and social structure explanations of urban poverty and crime. As we listen to his words this evening, I hope that we'll all feel encouraged to participate in an informed dialogue about how race, class, and place affect life and opportunity in America. If current events in America have told us anything, it's that there's need for these discussions and for collective efforts aimed at social change. Fellow members of the Montgomery College community, Professor William Julius Wilson.
Say, could you hand me that bottle of water? Well, that was a great introduction. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to address the faculty, students, and administrators at Montgomery College. My talk this evening comes 2 years after the 25th anniversary publication of my book, The Truly Disadvantaged. However, the economic processes emphasized in the book have continued: the loss of manufacturing jobs, the movement of jobs from cities to the suburbs and overseas, an even greater internationalization of the economy, especially through trade liberalization facilitated by free trade agreements in the 1990s. Moreover, given the expansion of low-wage jobs lacking fringe benefits and the polarization between high-wage and low-wage occupations, higher education is even more critical for social advancement in the labor market today. Furthermore, the adverse effects of deindustrialization on inner-city black employment continue to be a major problem. By and large, the conditions described in The Truly Disadvantaged are not qualitatively different more than 25 years later, even though when I wrote the book, urban conditions had been in decline for roughly 15 years, that is, since the early 1970s. There are still major racial differences in concentrated poverty. And although the country experienced dramatic declines in concentrated poverty during the economic boom of the 1990s, including declines in urban black neighborhoods, since 2000, there has been a substantial increase in high poverty neighborhoods. The problems of joblessness have continued and have even gotten worse for low-skilled blacks. The racial employment disparities have persisted. The black-white unemployment ratio seemed essentially fixed at 2.0 or greater, which means that even through economic upturns and downturns, the black unemployment rate has been at least twice that of the white unemployment rate, although during the recent economic crisis, the rate dipped below 2.0 from December 2009 to March 2010 because of the sharp increase in joblessness among whites. There have also been some important changes that should be noted. There is greater class polarization among African Americans. The outmigration of middle-class blacks from the inner city continues, but more have moved to the suburbs, including suburban black neighborhoods. and a growing number of poor blacks now live in the suburbs rather than the cities, many in older inner-ring suburbs that feature poverty rates approximating those in the inner cities. Immigration has been very consequential in reshaping cities and urban labor markets, especially low-wage labor markets. Incarceration has sharply increased in the more than 25 years since The Truly Disadvantaged was published, and has had profound consequences for the urban black poor. There is, of course, the Great Recession and its aftermath, including the current period of long-term joblessness. These changes notwithstanding, the basic arguments in The Truly Disadvantaged are as relevant and important today as they were when it was published. And the book created a paradigm that led to hundreds of empirical studies across social science disciplines in response to my arguments, particularly those dealing with the causes and effects of increased concentrated poverty. These included studies on neighborhood effects, economic restructuring and spatial mismatch, persistent poverty and depopulation, social isolation and concentration effects, and the male marriageable pool hypothesis. Now today, I would like to briefly discuss some of the important research on neighborhood effects, a topic that has received a good deal of attention from scholars across social science disciplines. The concept of neighborhood effects refers to the impact of various social, cultural, and demographic neighborhood conditions on the residents. And the research on neighborhood effects suggests that concentrated neighborhood poverty increases the likelihood of social isolation from mainstream institutions, joblessness, dropping out of school, lower educational achievement, involvement in crime, unsuccessful behavioral development and delinquency among adolescents, non-marital childbirth, and unsuccessful family management. In general, the research reveals that concentrated neighborhood poverty adversely affects one's chances in life, beginning in infancy and lasting well into adulthood. However, some scholars have been concerned that many of these studies reach conclusions about neighborhood effects based on data that do not address the problem of self-selection bias. Self-selection bias, a term used by social scientists to describe the effect of people grouping themselves together based on common characteristics. Self-selection bias. These scholars argue that the effects we attribute to poor neighborhoods may instead be caused by the characteristics of families and individuals who end up living there. In other words, they feel that disadvantaged neighborhoods might not be the cause of poor outcomes, but rather that families with the weakest job-related skills, with the lowest awareness of and concern for the effects of the local environment on their children's social development, with attitudes that hinder social mobility, and with the most burdensome personal problems, are simply more likely to live in these types of neighborhoods. For example, as the economists John Quigley and Stephen Raphael pointed out, those concerned about self-selection bias would very likely conclude that individuals with the weakest job-related skills will have chosen to locate in areas where employment access is low, for example, inner-city ghetto neighborhoods, simply because monthly rents are lower in these areas. Believe it or not. I mean, this is serious arguments that social scientists were making, and I was pulling my hair out when this was happening in the late 80s and early 1990s. Now, the initial concerns about self-selection bias can be attributed to two widely cited and influential papers by the sociologists Christopher Jenks and Susan Mayer in 1989 and 1990, which critically reviewed the then published literature on the effects of living in poor neighborhoods. See, my book generated a lot of research and people were testing my basic arguments. Indeed, following the publication of the Jenks and Mayer's papers, some scholars argued that neighborhood effects disappear when researchers use appropriate statistical techniques to account for self-selection bias. However, in addition to their criticisms of the failure of cross-sectional research, that is, research conducted at a single point in time, in addition to their criticisms of the failure of cross-sectional research to address adequately the problem of self-selection bias, there were two other important issues that Jenks and Mayer raised in highlighting the shortcomings of these studies. First of all, at the time Jenks and Mayer wrote their papers, sophisticated longitudinal research, that is, research that tracks individuals and families over time, sophisticated longitudinal research had yet to be published. They appropriately pointed out that the studies they reviewed, this is 1989, 1990, the studies they reviewed at that time ignored the issue of change. Quote, if neighborhood effects accumulate slowly, unquote, they state, quote, measuring neighborhood characteristics at a single point in time can lead to serious measurement error, unquote. And a way to address this problem empirically, they maintain, is to conduct controlled experiments. And secondly, Jenks and Mayer pointed out that a number of the cross-sectional studies they reviewed, including those that did not reveal the presence of neighborhood effects, used empirical measures of neighborhood variables that were not theoretically based and were therefore unable to identify causality. However, since the publication of the papers by Jenks and Mayer, important studies have emerged that either feature controlled experiments or highlight longitudinal research and theoretically driven data collection. And I would like to discuss these studies and then revisit the question that Jenks and Mayer originally raised about the power of neighborhood effects. Now, when one talks about controlled experiments, which is one of the things that Jenks and Mayer called for, when one talks about controlled experiments to gauge neighborhood effects, one immediately thinks of the moving to opportunity housing studies, MTO, moving to opportunity. The MTO experiment, a housing pilot program undertaken by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, between 1994 and 1998, was framed as a test of the arguments presented in my book, The Truly Disadvantaged, that neighborhoods really matter in the lives of poor individuals. And HUD's MTO demonstration program conducted a lottery that awarded housing vouchers to families living in public housing developments in high poverty neighborhoods in 5 cities: Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Over 4,600 families entered the lottery, thus indicating their desire to move, and were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. One was awarded housing vouchers that could be used to rent in the private market in any area. One was awarded housing vouchers that were restricted to private rentals in low poverty neighborhoods. And one did not receive either voucher in the lottery and was therefore treated as a control group to be compared with the other 2 groups. This 3rd group we can call the lottery losers. They entered the lottery but did not win. Now, the MTO interim evaluation studies were considered superior to other research on neighborhood effects because they were based on data from a randomized experimental design that eliminated the self-selection bias that, in the words of one scholar, had made it difficult to clearly determine the association between living in poor neighborhoods and individual outcomes. In other words, by comparing randomly selected groups with the same socioeconomic characteristics and the same desire to move to better neighborhoods, those who received vouchers, which enabled them to move, which we call the experimental groups, and those that did not receive voucher, the control group, the lottery losers, the control group, by comparing the control group with these experimental groups, the MTO studies effectively removed individual self-selection as an explanation of the findings, because you're comparing people who want to move to better areas, and they have the same characteristics. So if neighborhoods really matter, there should be significant differences between the lottery losers who did not receive vouchers and the lottery winners who went on to better neighborhoods. The report and publications on the interim evaluation, which were finalized in 2003, provided mixed evidence for neighborhood effects when comparing the group whose MTO vouchers were restricted to low poverty areas with the group that did not receive vouchers. On the one hand, during the 5-year period following random assignment, the MTO movers who relocated to low poverty areas were more likely to experience improvements in mental health and less likely to be obese, and girls experienced a significant reduction in risky behavior, that is, drinking, taking drugs, engaging in sex, and so on. On the other hand, research investigators found no evidence of an impact on employment rates and earnings, or of any marked improvement in the educational or physical health outcomes of children and young men. And these mixed results led some, including reporters, to question whether there really are enduring negative effects of living in poor, segregated neighborhoods. And they seem to reinforce the view among some scholars that when studies effectively control for self-selection bias, neighborhood effects are weak or disappear. But one of the criticisms of the MTO interim evaluations is that they really did not address the problem of the long-term effects of living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. However, in the most recent study of the effects of the MTO, the study published in the Journal of Science in the fall of 2012, the researchers were also able to gauge the longer-term effects, 10 to 15 years, of moving from high poverty to lower poverty neighborhoods. And these effects included significant improved mental health and subjective well-being, that is, happiness. In fact, the findings were quite robust and provided rigorous scientific evidence for the assumptions that many of us have made about the effects of living in distressed neighborhoods, neighborhoods with high violent crime rates and other rates of social dislocation, on mental health and subjective well-being. Indeed, many of the voucher holders expressed feelings of relief because of their move to less distressed neighborhoods. However, the researchers also found that although the residents perceived their new neighborhoods on the average to be safer, moving to these neighborhoods did not significantly affect economic self-sufficiency, that is, employment and welfare receipt. A finding that once again raises questions about the ultimate power of neighborhood effects. Now, this finding was not surprising to those of us familiar with the design of the MTO experiment. Although the research on the MTO experiment is rigorous, there are serious issues with the design of the experiment that limit the extent to which one can generalize about neighborhood effects on issues such as economic self-sufficiency. First of all, many MTO movers who experienced difficulties in moving and obtaining apartments in areas of lower poverty relocated to neighborhoods that were not significantly different from the ones they left. For example, 3/5 of the MTO families entered highly segregated black neighborhoods, and such neighborhoods tend to be considerably less advantaged than integrated areas. My colleague at Harvard, Robert Sampson, analyzed the neighborhood attainment of all Chicago MTO families and found that after approximately 7 years, although the voucher winners resided in neighborhoods with poverty rates somewhat lower than the neighborhood of the voucher losers, the control families, both groups clustered in segregated black neighborhoods that were still considerably poorer than what an overwhelming majority of Americans will ever experience. Neighborhoods with poverty rates of roughly 30% or more. Or I should say, neighborhoods with poverty rates of roughly 30%. I don't want to add the or more. Furthermore, as pointed out by the economists John Quigley and Stephen Raphael, the experiment did not improve accessibility to employment opportunities for MTO movers because their new neighborhoods were no closer to areas of employment growth. They may have had lower poverty rates, but they were no closer to areas of employment growth. And Lawrence Katz, and the Harvard economist and one of the co-authors of the article in Science, told the New York Times that, and I quote, "The preference for educated workers in this country was so strong that changing neighborhoods did not do much to improve job options for the participants who were mostly African American women without college education," unquote. And finally, the adults who entered the program had been exposed all their lives to the effects of severely concentrated disadvantage, and no matter how long they are followed in their new neighborhoods, the effects of those earlier years are not fully erased. For all these reasons, their new neighborhoods were highly unlikely to result in significant improvements in economic self-sufficiency, despite being safer and less distressed. However, the MTO experiment, although quite rigorous, is not the most ideal research design to capture the long-term cumulative effects of concentrated poverty, especially concentrated poverty in racially segregated neighborhoods. And I would therefore like to focus briefly on several important recent longitudinal studies that were designed to measure the cumulative effects of living in high poverty and segregated neighborhoods. And I begin with the research of one of my former students, Patrick Sharkey of NYU, New York University, as presented in his recent book, Stuck in Place: Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality, which was published in 2013. In analyzing data from the panel study of income dynamics, that's PSID, I'll refer to that quite often, with methods that measure intergenerational economic mobility. The PSID tracked families over time. Sharkey demonstrates the importance of gauging the longer-term effects of living in poor neighborhoods when considering racial differences. He states, quote, "When white families live in a poor neighborhood, they typically do so for only one generation. In Black American families, neighborhood poverty is commonly multi-generational." He also found that since the 1970s, a majority of Black families have resided in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods in consecutive generation, compared to only 7% of white families. And that, quote, 72% of Black adults living in today's urban ghettos, that is, neighborhoods that are majority Black and among the poorest quarter, the bottom quarter of all American neighborhoods, were raised by parents who also lived in the ghetto a generation earlier. In short, Sharkey states, quote, "The problem of the urban ghetto is not simply that it has persisted over time, but that the same families have experienced the disadvantages associated with life in the ghetto over multiple generations." And this problem can be particularly severe for children, he states. Analyzing data from a special supplement of the PSID, which included a set of questions asked of children, Sharkey was able to examine how the development outcome of children differ dependent on the neighborhood environment history of their families. And he found that children whose families lived in disadvantaged neighborhoods over multiple generations show developmental outcomes that are substantially worse than children whose families reside in poor neighborhoods in a single generation, even after he took into account other family factors that might affect children's development. We should also consider another important and related study on children's development that Sharkey co-authored with Robert Sampson and Stephen Rodenbush, which examined the durable effects of concentrated poverty on Black children's verbal ability. And they studied a representative sample of 750 African American children, ages 6 to 12, who were growing up in the city of Chicago in 1995, and followed them for up to 7 years. The children were given a reading examination and vocabulary tests at 3 different periods. And their study shows, and I quote, that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant ability in children, unquote. Now, children's verbal ability certainly has consequences for school performances, including the completion of high school. Jeffrey Watke, David Harding, and Felix Ehrwitz's important recent study, also using the panel study of income dynamics, the PSID, used it to examine the effects of long-term exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods on high school graduation. And they tracked 4,154 children by measuring their neighborhood contexts once each year from age 1 to 17 and found that continuous exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods, that is, neighborhoods featuring high rates of poverty, unemployment, single-parent households, and welfare receipt, as well as few well-educated adults throughout, quote, the entire childhood life course, has a devastating impact on the chances of graduating from high school, unquote. Now, I should point out that each of these longitudinal studies was guided by theoretical arguments. However, perhaps the study that most dramatically addresses Jenks and Mayer's concerns, the studies of neighborhood effects, should include empirical measures of neighborhood variables that are theoretically based, is Robert Sampson's recently published book, Great American City, subtitle, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. Now, Sampson, a colleague at Harvard in the Department of Sociology, is a quantitative sociologist who understands the logic of scientific inquiry and therefore the importance of integrating the structure of explanation, the meaning and significance of concepts, and the nature of evidence. In Sampson's research, empirical measures of concepts and analysis of data are theoretically driven, and he fully exploits his very rich data sets by taking a pluralistic stance on the nature of evidence to access causation. His findings flow mainly from a comprehensive research endeavor called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. And using the iconic city of Chicago as a laboratory, this project collected longitudinal data on children, families, and neighborhoods. It is one of the most ambitious and creative research projects in the history of social science inquiry. Sampson analyzed how the mechanisms of social causality are shaped by the integration of individual, neighborhood, and structural dynamics. And in the process, he demonstrates the powerful effects of ecologically concentrated disadvantaged areas, such as the inner city ghetto, on both individual outcomes and rates of social behavior across neighborhoods, including poverty, joblessness, single-parent families with children, verbal ability, violence, incarceration, and collective efficacy. And he shows how these effects are magnified by racial segregation. Now, all of the studies I have reviewed following the publication of the Jenks and Mayer papers clearly revealed the importance of neighborhoods on social outcomes. No one talks today about self-selection bias that much in the face of these powerful studies recently published. And I hasten to point out that these are the kinds of studies that Jenks and Mayer actually called for in 1990. And I suspect that if these studies had existed at the time they wrote their papers, they would have obviously had a different view of the power of neighborhood effects. Nowhere is the power of neighborhood effects more clearly seen than in many inner-city black ghettos that experience significant depopulation following the cessation of the Great Migration wave of blacks from the South seeking employment opportunities and burgeoning northern industries, which characterized a good part of the 20th century. The Great Migration. However, the Great Migration abruptly ended around 1970 in the face of the accelerated out-migration of central city manufacturing due to improvements in transportation and the suburbanization of employment. So, with the cessation of migration from the South and the out-migration of higher income families, many poor black inner-city neighborhoods, especially those in the Midwest and Northeast, changed from densely populated communities of recently arrived migrants to depopulated areas with thousands of vacant lots and abandoned buildings. How many of you have watched David Simon's The Wire? How many? The Wire, W-I-R-E, HBO's The Wire. Listen, if you haven't seen this show, go order the DVDs, believe me. It is an incredible show. Absolutely incredible. Believe me, you got to go buy these DVDs. And that show is based on scientific data, by the way. I mean, it's fiction, but he was informed by reading the works of social scientists. There was a panel discussion at Harvard in 2008 or 2009. I chaired the panel and included David Simon, Jeffrey Canada, head of the Harlem Children's Zone, and two other people. And I chaired the panel, and I called up David Simon 1 week before the show, before the panel discussion, to ask him if he had any questions. And I was about to tell him what a thrill it is to speak with you, sir. I've watched each episode of The Wire at least 6 times, and I'm not exaggerating. I mean, this show got incredible reviews, but poor viewership because it was too sophisticated for the average audience. But it is an incredible show. And so I was about to tell him, what a thrill it was for me to speak with him. You know what he said to me? He says, Professor Wilson, what an honor it is for me to speak with you. Do you know that your book, When Work Disappears, helped us shape the first 3 seasons of The Wire? Man, I started walking around campus with a swagger after that. And these neighborhoods, by the way, The Wire takes place in Baltimore, and so, and he really captures some of the inner city depopulated areas with abandoned buildings and vacant lots. These neighborhoods have been slow to revive because of the combined effects of poverty and racial segregation. Working and middle-class black families leave these neighborhoods, but their ranks, for the most part, have neither been replaced with new migrants flowing into this country, nor with any other non-black ethnic group. Indeed, these groups tend to avoid inner-city black ghetto neighborhoods. I described in When Work Disappears how the disappearance of work in these neighborhoods not only adversely affected individuals and families, but the social life of the neighborhood as well. Inner city joblessness is a severe problem that is often overlooked or obscured when the focus is mainly on poverty and its consequences. Despite increases in the concentration of poverty since 1970, inner cities have always featured high levels of poverty. But the level of inner city joblessness, especially in the depopulated neighborhoods today, far exceeds that of earlier periods. In explaining the growth of inner city jobless poverty, one has to, first of all, take into account the way in which racial segregation interacts with other changes in the larger society to produce the recent escalating rates of neighborhood joblessness, including the nationwide decline in the fortunes of low-skilled workers and the growing suburbanization of jobs, not to mention the relocation of jobs overseas. Secondly, one has to consider the impact of changes in the class, racial, and demographic composition of the inner city. Indeed, following the end of the Great Migration from the South and a steady out-migration of more advantaged families since 1970, the proportion of non-poor families and prime-age working adults has decreased sharply in many inner-city ghettos, especially in the Northeast and Midwest. The city of Baltimore is a prime example. The increasing and prolonged joblessness, the declining proportion of non-poor families, and the overall depopulation have made it more difficult to sustain basic institutions to achieve adequate levels of social organization in these neighborhoods. All of these changes have had a profound effect on the social organization of these neighborhoods, resulting in a weak institutional resource base. You see, it is easier for parents to control the behavior of the children in their neighborhoods when a strong institutional research base exists, and when the links between community institutions such as churches, schools, political organizations, businesses, and civic clubs are strong or secure. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activities such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and the formation of gangs can take root in the neighborhood. Take drug trafficking. Research reveals an association between declining legitimate employment opportunities among inner city residents and increased incentives to sell drugs. In neighborhoods plagued by high levels of joblessness, insufficient economic opportunities, and high residential mobility are unable to control the volatile drug market and the violent crimes related to it. As a result, the behavior and norms in the drug market are more likely to influence the actions of others in the neighborhood, even those who are not directly involved in drug activity. Drug dealers escalate the use and spread of guns in the neighborhood, which in turn raises the likelihood that others, particularly youngsters, will come to view the possession of weapons as necessary or desirable for self-protection, settling disputes, gaining respect from peers and other individuals. Moreover, the drug industry actively recruits teenagers in the neighborhood, not only because they are willing to accept lower wages, but also because they tend to be more courageous and will take risks that more mature adults would avoid. Inner-city black youth, with limited prospects for stable and attractive employment, are easily lured into the drug traffic and therefore invariably find themselves involved in the violent behavior that accompanies it. David Simon brilliantly captured that in HBO's The Wire. To repeat, a weak institutional resource base is what distinguishes high jobless inner city neighborhoods from stable middle class and working class areas. As one resident of a high jobless neighborhood on the south side of Chicago put it, quote, "Our children, you know, seems to be more at risk than any other children there is because there's no library for them to go to. There's not a center they can go to. There's no field house they can go into. There's nothing at all," unquote. Parents in high jobless neighborhoods have a much more difficult task of controlling the behavior of their adolescents, of preventing them from getting involved in activities detrimental to pro-social development. And given the lack of organizational capacity and a weak institutional resource base in these neighborhoods, some parents choose to protect their children by isolating them from activities in the neighborhood, including the avoidance of contact and interaction with neighborhood families. And whenever possible, and often with great difficulty, when one considers the problems of transportation and limited financial resources, they attempt to establish contacts and cultivate relations with individuals, families, and institutions outside the neighborhood, such as church groups, schools, and community recreation programs. It is just as indefensible to treat inner-city residents as superheroes who overcome chronic racial and economic subordination as it is to view them as helpless victims. We should, however, appreciate the restricted range of choices that are available to inner-city families and residents in jobless neighborhoods, because they live under constraints and face challenges that most people in the larger society do not experience or can't even imagine. And I wish there was greater awareness and appreciation of their incredible ordeals, especially among national policymakers, to overcome beliefs that simply attribute joblessness and poverty to individual shortcomings. Such beliefs do not engender strong support for social programs to end inequality. Listen, do I have time for a few policy statements? Okay. So let me conclude by discussing whether the response of the policy community has been sufficient to the challenges posed by concentrated poverty. If we focus only on Congress, the answer is obvious. However, in the time remaining, I would like to restrict this question to a discussion of the actions of the Obama administration. Quite frankly, I think that Obama's programs have prevented poverty, including concentrated poverty, from rapidly rising, considering the terrible economy we've had over the years. Things have recovered a bit, but when it was really bad, his programs kept poverty and concentrated poverty from skyrocketing. Obama's stimulus package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, earmarked $80 billion for low-income Americans, which included such things as an extension of unemployment benefits, a temporary increase in the earned income tax credit, and substantial additional funds for food stamps. It also included nearly $4 billion in job training and workforce enhancement programs, and $2 billion for neighborhood stabilization efforts. I was invited to the Tavis Smiley program one day, right after my book, More Than Just Race, was published, 2009. You know, Tavis Smiley is a big critic of Barack Obama. And he was going on and on about Obama not doing anything for poor people. And I said, you know, if anybody had told me that a president of the United States or a president's administration would set aside $80 billion for poor people 5 years ago, I would have laughed at them. By the way, I asked them, well, never mind. This is being taped. Moreover, I consider the health care legislation as an anti-poverty program. Over the long term, the health care bill will have a huge positive impact on blacks and Latinos, two groups who are seriously underrepresented among those with private health insurance. Now, in addition to this legislation, the Obama administration has also promoted some noteworthy programs aimed directly at addressing concentrated poverty. I specifically have in mind two programs. The Department of Housing and Urban Development's Choice Neighborhood Program and the Obama administration's Promise Neighborhood Program, which is patterned after the Harlem Children's Zone, a 97-block laboratory in central Harlem that combines two reform-oriented charter schools with a web of community services designed for children from birth to college graduation to provide a supportive and positive environment outside the school. The Choice Neighborhood Program, which in effect is designed to replace Hope 6, launched in the early 1990s to help overcome the adverse effects of public housing projects in blighted neighborhoods. The Choice Neighborhood Program goes beyond the rehabilitation of physically deteriorated public housing neighborhoods, which was the focus of Hope 6, and includes comprehensive neighborhood investments ranging from early childhood education to employment, safety, and transportation components. Under Obama's Promise Neighborhood Initiative, hundreds of organizations across the country applied for planning grants, and in 2011, 20 were awarded between $300,000 and $500,000, and these planning funds are intended to help communities to better position themselves when applying for the full Promise Neighborhood implementation grants. But the budget for Promise Neighborhoods has been severely cut by the current Congress. Nonetheless, the program is indicative of the administration's awareness of the problems of concentrated poverty and joblessness. Then finally, just let me say that despite the severe constraints that Obama faces, given the Republican control of the House, he has recently introduced some new initiatives to address problems of poverty through executive action, including unilaterally increasing the minimum wage for workers under new federal contracts from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour in an effort to generate momentum for a minimum wage hike for all low-income Americans, and introducing a new program with leading businesses and foundations called My Brother's Keeper, which is designed to help boys and young men of color who are at risk. I would like to see more of these kinds of interventions, but with much higher levels of financial support. And to make these suggestions with few illusions that they are feasible in the current political climate. But it is important to think seriously about the kinds of projects we should discuss when a more favorable political environment does eventually emerge. Thank you.